It was a calm, warm evening as the last rays of sunlight bathed the quiet neighborhood park in a soft, golden hue. Families strolled leisurely along the winding pathways. Children's laughter echoed in the air as they played on swings and slides, and joggers weaved through the crowd in steady rhythms. Everything seemed peaceful, as if the world had temporarily slowed down to let people bask in the fading light of the day. Among the evening parkgoers was Lisa Carter, a young black mother in her late 20s, gently cradling her 8-month-old daughter Mia against her chest. The baby had only just fallen asleep after a long, tiring day filled with cries, diaper changes, and moments of joy. For Lisa, this walk in the park was a brief escape, a chance to clear her head and feel like things might be okay, even if just for a little while. Lisa wore a simple but neat outfit: dark jeans, a soft blue blouse, and sneakers. Her hair was tied back into a low bun, and she had a calm but slightly wary expression, a look many mothers develop after balancing exhaustion with a constant sense of alertness. Tonight was supposed to be a peaceful outing. She'd finished her shift at the local bookstore earlier than usual, hurried home, fed Mia, and decided to take her out for some fresh air. It was one of those rare moments where she didn't have to think about bills, errands, or the stress that had become part of her daily life. She wasn't wealthy, far from it, but she worked hard to provide for her daughter and maintain some semblance of stability after losing her husband in a car accident a year ago. This walk was her way of finding a brief moment of solace in a world that often felt too chaotic. As Lisa walked slowly along the path, rocking Mia gently with each step, she passed by a group of teenagers gathered near the park's central fountain. They were chatting loudly, occasionally breaking into bursts of laughter. Lisa didn't pay them much attention. She was used to the usual chatter of teens in the area, and besides, she was more focused on keeping Mia asleep. But someone else had noticed the group officer Mike Reynolds, a middle-aged white cop patrolling the park in his dark blue uniform. Reynolds was known in the neighborhood, though not for reasons that inspired respect or admiration. His presence often brought tension rather than a sense of safety. His stern face, rigid posture, and aggressive demeanor made it clear he wasn't the kind of officer who approached situations with patience or empathy. He carried an air of authority that demanded compliance, and he rarely bothered to hide his disdain for certain people, especially those who didn't fit his narrow view of what he considered decent. Reynolds had been assigned to patrol this park after several complaints of disturbances in the area, though none of the reported incidents was serious. To him, it was just another routine assignment, another boring night in a part of town he didn't particularly care for. As he observed the group of teens from a distance, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He didn't like how they were standing there, laughing loudly as if they owned the place. It didn't matter that they weren't doing anything illegal. Reynolds had a habit of assuming the worst in people, especially when those people happened to be young and black. He decided he'd keep an eye on them, just in case. After a few minutes, Reynolds shifted his gaze and noticed Lisa walking down the path. Something about her caught his attention, not because she was doing anything wrong, but because in his mind she seemed out of place. A black woman, alone with a baby in the park as night approached. That was enough for him to feel justified in making a mental note of her. He didn't recognize her from the neighborhood, and that alone made her suspicious in his eyes. He had spent years on the force, and during that time he had developed a cynical view of the world. People were either law-abiding or troublemakers, and he believed he could tell the difference just by looking at them. And right now, Lisa Carter was ticking all the wrong boxes in his mind. Lisa hadn't noticed Reynolds watching her at first. She was too focused on keeping Mia calm as they approached a small ice cream cart near the park entrance. She thought about stopping to get a treat, But just as she was about to make her way toward it, she felt something, an instinctive sense of being watched. It was a subtle feeling, but one that immediately put her on edge. She slowed her pace slightly, glancing around without making it obvious. That's when she saw him, the officer, standing a few yards away, his eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her heart rate spike. Lisa had dealt with moments like this before, random encounters where people in positions of authority looked at her, not with kindness, but with a silent judgment that made her feel as though she had already done something wrong without even knowing what. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. There was no reason to panic. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just a mother out for an evening walk with her baby, but knowing that didn't make the feeling go away. It was something she had grown accustomed to over the years, a quiet, gnawing sense of unease that surfaced whenever she found herself in situations like this. Being a black woman meant being aware of how others perceived her, even when she was simply minding her own business. She had learned to navigate these moments carefully, to avoid escalating them into something worse. But tonight, with Mia in her arms, the stakes felt higher. She couldn't afford for anything to go wrong. Reynolds began to move toward her, slowly at first, as if trying to appear casual. But Lisa could tell from the way he walked, from the way his hand rested near his belt, that this wasn't just a random stroll. He was coming for her. For a brief second, she considered turning around and heading back the way she came, but she quickly dismissed the idea. That would only make her look guilty in his eyes, and she knew how dangerous assumptions like his could be. She tightened her grip on Mia and kept walking, her mind racing as she tried to think of the best way to handle the situation. Should she speak first? Should she wait for him to say something? Should she act friendly or firm? Before she could decide, Reynolds was already in front of her, blocking her path. "Excuse me, Miss Officer," Reynolds said, his voice carrying a tone of authority that was hard to miss. He stood directly in Lisa's path, his stance wide and imposing, with one hand resting casually on his belt near his holster. Lisa instinctively slowed down, her heart beginning to pound in her chest. She tightened her grip on Mia, who was still peacefully asleep in her arms, unaware of the sudden tension in the air. Lisa took a moment to steady herself before replying, keeping her voice calm and measured. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, doing her best to mask the unease that was building inside her. She knew better than to show fear in situations like this. Fear could be misread, twisted, and used against her. Reynolds took a step closer, invading her personal space in a way that felt deliberate. He didn't answer her question right away, instead letting his eyes scan her from head to toe, as if sizing her up. "You're out pretty late," he said finally, his tone laced with subtle accusation. "What are you doing here?" Lisa resisted the urge to roll her eyes. It wasn't the first time she had been questioned like this, as if simply existing in a public space was something that required justification. She took another breath, keeping her composure. "I'm just taking a walk with my daughter before heading home," she said, her voice remaining steady despite the growing tension. Reynolds didn't seem satisfied with her answer. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to gauge whether she was telling the truth. "Alone? No one else with you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Lisa felt her patience begin to wear thin. What was he trying to imply? That a mother couldn't take a walk with her child without arousing suspicion? "Yes, alone," she replied, her tone firmer now. "Is there a law against that?" Reynolds' eyes flicked to the baby in her arms, then back to her face. He ignored her question, choosing instead to press further. "Where do you live?" he demanded, his voice harder now, less casual. Lisa's fingers tightened around Mia protectively. She knew that this interaction was quickly becoming something more than a casual inquiry. It was becoming a confrontation, one she hadn't asked for but now found herself trapped in. She also knew that refusing to answer could escalate things further, but giving in to his invasive questioning didn't sit right with her either. "I live nearby," she said cautiously, choosing her words carefully. Just a few blocks away. Reynolds's lips curled into a faint smirk, as if her answer had confirmed something for him. "Nearby, huh? Funny. I don't think I've seen you around before." Lisa felt a spark of irritation flare up inside her. Was he really going to play that game? She had lived in this neighborhood for over 3 years, yet here he was, acting as if she didn't belong. She knew exactly what this was: thinly veiled harassment, the kind that too many people like her experienced on a regular basis. Still, she reminded herself to stay calm. Losing her temper wouldn't help. "I've lived here for a while," she said evenly. Maybe you just didn't notice. The smirk on Reynolds's face faded slightly at her response, replaced by a look of mild annoyance. Clearly, he wasn't used to people standing their ground with him, especially not people like her. He took another step closer, his presence looming over her. "Let me see some ID," he said abruptly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lisa blinked, caught off guard by the sudden demand. "ID? For what?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. She wasn't driving a car. She wasn't doing anything remotely suspicious. She was literally just walking in the park with her baby. "Is there a reason you need to see my ID, officer?" Reynolds's expression hardened at her question. "It's routine," he said curtly. "I need to make sure you're who you say you are." Lisa felt her jaw clench. Routine? Since when was walking in a public park grounds for an ID check? She knew her rights. She wasn't required to show identification unless she was being detained or suspected of committing a crime. But standing up to a cop, especially one who was clearly looking for a reason to assert his authority, was a dangerous game. Still, something inside her refused to back down completely. She shifted Maya in her arms, making sure her daughter was secure before replying. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't believe I'm required to show ID unless I'm being detained." "Am I being detained?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. For a moment, Reynolds didn't say anything. He just stared at her, as if trying to decide how far he wanted to push this. Lisa could see the gears turning in his head, the flicker of frustration in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. "You've got a smart mouth," he muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for her to hear. Lisa's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay composed. She didn't respond to his comment, knowing that engaging further could escalate things even more. Reynolds finally stepped back, but only slightly. "Fine," he said grudgingly. "You're not being detained. But if I were you, I'd be careful about wandering around alone at night. You never know what kind of trouble you might run into." His words were clearly meant to be a threat, a reminder that he held the power in this situation. Lisa didn't flinch. She met his gaze head-on, refusing to show any sign of fear. "Thank you for the advice," she said coolly. "I'll keep that in mind." For a moment, it seemed like the confrontation was over. Reynolds turned slightly, as if he was about to walk away. But then, as if on impulse, he turned back toward her, his expression darkening. "Actually," he said, his voice low and menacing, "on second thought, maybe I should check that bag you're carrying. Just to make sure you're not hiding anything." Lisa's eyes widened in disbelief. "Seriously," she said, unable to keep the incredulity out of her voice. "It's a diaper bag. It has baby formula and diapers. Do you really think I'm hiding something in there?" Reynolds shrugged, the smirk returning to his face. "You'd be surprised what people try to hide," he said casually. "Go ahead, open it up." Lisa hesitated. She knew she had nothing to hide, but the demand felt invasive and demeaning. It wasn't about what was in the bag, it was about power, about making her submit to his authority. "No," she said finally, her voice steady. I'm not opening my bag. You have no reason to search it. Reynolds's smirk disappeared instantly, replaced by a look of cold anger. He took another step toward her, his hand moving closer to his belt. You refusing a lawful order, he asked, his tone dangerous. Lisa's heart raced, but she stood her ground. It's not a lawful order, she said firmly. I know my rights. You have no probable cause. The tension in the air was palpable. People nearby had started to notice the confrontation, their eyes darting toward Lisa and the officer. No one said anything, but the weight of their silent attention added to the pressure of the moment. Reynolds opened his mouth, as if about to say something, but before he could, Mia stirred in Lisa's arms, letting out a soft whimper. The sound seemed to break the spell, reminding everyone, including Lisa, that there was a child involved in this tense standoff. Lisa gently rocked Mia, whispering soothing words to calm her down. Look, she said quietly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. I just want to go home. I'm not causing any trouble. Let's not make this something it doesn't need to be. For a brief moment it seemed like Reynolds might back off. But then, in one swift motion, he reached out and grabbed Lisa's arm. I said, open the bag, he snarled. The sudden contact jolted Lisa, and her body tensed in response. Mia began to cry, her wails cutting through the evening air like a siren. The confrontation had just escalated beyond words, and Lisa knew there was no turning back now. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as Reynolds's grip tightened around her arm. It wasn't just the physical pain, though his hold was strong enough to hurt. It was the sudden realization that things were spiraling out of control. Her baby, Mia, wailed loudly in her arms, her tiny voice echoing through the park and drawing more attention from the people nearby. A few onlookers stopped, glancing toward the commotion with concern, but no one dared to intervene. For a moment, Lisa thought about simply giving in, opening the bag and letting this officer have his way, just to make it all end. But then she felt something deeper stir inside her, something stronger than fear. It was a mixture of anger, frustration, and a fierce protective instinct for her child. No, she thought. This isn't right. She tried to pull her arm free, careful not to jostle Mia too much, but Reynolds only tightened his grip further. I told you to open the bag, he growled, his eyes blazing with hostility. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Lisa's jaw clenched. She was on the verge of snapping back at him when a middle-aged woman in jogging clothes approached cautiously, her eyes wide with concern. Is everything okay here? The woman asked hesitantly, her gaze shifting nervously between Lisa and the officer. Reynolds shot the woman a glare, clearly annoyed by her presence. Stay out of this, ma'am, he barked, his tone dismissive. This doesn't concern you. The woman hesitated, looking as if she wanted to say more, but ultimately backed away, perhaps sensing that confronting the officer would only make things worse. Lisa's anger grew. The audacity of this man to treat her like a criminal in front of her child, to intimidate anyone who dared question his authority, was infuriating. But she knew she couldn't afford to lose her composure, not with Mia still crying in her arms. Taking a deep breath, Lisa spoke in a calm but firm voice. Officer, please, I'm holding a baby. You're scaring her. Let go of my arm. Her words didn't have the intended effect. If anything, they seemed to irritate Reynolds further. He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. Maybe you should have thought about that before you started acting suspicious, he sneered. Now, open the damn bag, or I'll do it myself. At that moment, something inside Lisa snapped. She had done everything right. She had stayed calm, tried to reason with him, and even appealed to his humanity. But it was clear now that this man didn't care about reason or fairness. He wasn't interested in resolving the situation peacefully. He wanted to dominate, to assert his power over her simply because he could. And Lisa was done playing along. "No," she said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You have no right to search my bag without a warrant or probable cause." "I know my rights." Reynolds' eyes narrowed dangerously. He was not used to being defied, especially not by someone he perceived as beneath him. His grip on her arm tightened even further, and Lisa winced in pain, though she refused to cry out. "You're resisting a lawful order," he said coldly. "That's grounds for arrest." Lisa's mind raced. Arrest? Was he serious? The idea of being handcuffed and taken to a police station with her infant daughter in tow was terrifying. She couldn't let that happen, not only because it would traumatize Mia, but because she knew how these situations often ended for people like her. She had heard too many stories, seen too many headlines about encounters like this one turning deadly. "No," she thought again. "I won't let it come to that." Gathering every ounce of courage she had, Lisa shifted her weight slightly, bracing herself. "If you don't let go of my arm," she said slowly, enunciating each word carefully, "I will consider this assault, and I will defend myself." Reynolds stared at her, momentarily caught off guard by her boldness. For a split second, he seemed to hesitate, as if weighing his options. But then, just as quickly, his expression hardened. "You think you can threaten me?" he spat. "You're making a big mistake, lady." Before Lisa could respond, Reynolds suddenly reached for her bag with his free hand, clearly intending to grab it by force. Instinctively, Lisa stepped back, pulling her arm free in the process. The sudden movement caused Mia to wail even louder, her tiny fists clenching in distress. Lisa's heart ached at the sound, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She knew she had only a few seconds to act before things escalated even further. Without thinking, Lisa shifted Mia into her left arm and reached out with her right hand, grabbing the first thing she could find, Reynolds' taser, which was clipped to his belt. She didn't have a plan, it was pure instinct, driven by the need to protect herself and her child. Reynolds' eyes widened in shock as he realized what she had done, but by then it was too late. Lisa had already pulled the taser free and taken a step back, putting some distance between them. "Stay back," she said sharply, her voice trembling slightly but still strong. She held the taser up, her thumb hovering over the trigger. "Don't come any closer." For the first time since the confrontation began, Reynolds hesitated. He hadn't expected this. In his mind, Lisa was supposed to be intimidated, submissive. She wasn't supposed to fight back. And yet, here she was, standing her ground, a taser in hand and fire in her eyes. The onlookers, who had been watching the scene unfold in stunned silence, began to murmur among themselves. Some of them looked alarmed, while others seemed quietly impressed by Lisa's courage. One man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a baseball cap, took a cautious step forward. "Hey, maybe we should call someone," he suggested, his voice low but urgent. "This is getting out of hand." Reynolds' face turned red with anger and embarrassment. He was a man who thrived on control, and right now he had none. Being publicly defied by a woman, a black woman no less, in front of a growing crowd was more than his fragile ego could handle. "You're really gonna pull a weapon on a cop?" he growled, taking a step toward her despite her warning. "You have any idea what kind of trouble you're asking for?" Lisa's grip on the taser tightened. She could feel her pulse racing, her palms beginning to sweat, but she didn't lower her guard. "You assaulted me first," she shot back. "I'm defending myself. Back off." Her voice was louder now, carrying an edge of desperation. She didn't want to use the taser, especially not in front of Mia, but she would if she had to. She wasn't going to let this man bully her into submission. For a tense moment it seemed as though Reynolds might call her bluff. He took another step forward, his hand moving toward his baton. Lisa braced herself, preparing to act if necessary. But before either of them could make another move, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "That's enough." Both Lisa and Reynolds turned toward the source of the voice. A second police officer, older and more composed, was approaching the scene with deliberate calm. His badge gleamed under the dim park lights, and his expression was one of quiet authority. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his eyes flicking between Lisa, Reynolds, and the taser in her hand. Reynolds opened his mouth to speak, but the other officer held up a hand to silence him. "I wasn't asking you," he said firmly. He turned his attention to Lisa, his expression softening slightly. Can you tell me what happened?" Lisa hesitated, still holding the taser tightly. She wasn't sure if she could trust this new officer, but something in his demeanor suggested he might be different from Reynolds. Slowly, she began to lower the taser, though she kept it within reach. "He grabbed me," she said, her voice still shaking from the adrenaline. "I was just walking with my baby, and he started harassing me. When I refused to let him search my bag, he grabbed my arm and wouldn't let go. I had to defend myself." The officer listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. He didn't interrupt or question her account, which gave her a small glimmer of hope. Reynolds, meanwhile, looked furious. "She resisted," he snapped. "She pulled a weapon on me." "That's assault on an officer," the other officer frowned but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to Lisa. "Do you have any witnesses who saw what happened?" he asked. Lisa glanced around at the crowd. Several people nodded, including the woman in jogging clothes and the man in the baseball cap. "I saw everything," the woman said. "She didn't do anything wrong. He was the one who got aggressive." The man in the baseball cap stepped forward as well. "Yeah, same here. He was out of line." Reynolds's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He looked as though he wanted to argue, but the other officer's stern expression stopped him. "All right," the officer said calmly. "Let's all take a step back and calm down. If you could put the taser down, we can sort this out properly." Lisa hesitated for a moment longer, then slowly placed the taser on the ground. She knew this wasn't over yet, but at least for now the immediate danger had passed. Lisa slowly placed the taser on the ground, her heart still racing, adrenaline pumping through her veins. She didn't trust Reynolds to back off completely, but the presence of the second officer gave her a sliver of hope that the situation wouldn't spiral further into chaos. Her arms tightened around Mia, who had stopped wailing but was now quietly whimpering, sensing her mother's tension. The other officer, whose name tag read Sergeant Whitaker, approached cautiously, keeping his hands visible to Lisa, a subtle sign that he wasn't looking to escalate the situation any further. "Thank you, ma'am," Whitaker said in a calm, measured voice. "Now, let's take a moment and talk this through. No one's getting arrested tonight unless there's a real reason." Reynolds, still visibly fuming, clenched his fists at his sides, his eyes darting between Lisa and Whitaker. He clearly didn't appreciate being undermined in front of a growing crowd, and Lisa could see the tension radiating off him. "She threatened me with a weapon," Reynolds spat, his voice dripping with indignation. "She pulled a taser on a law enforcement officer. That's a felony. You can't just let her walk away like nothing happened." Whitaker turned toward Reynolds, his expression unreadable but firm. "I'll handle this," he said quietly, but with authority, a subtle reminder that rank still mattered in moments like this. "Step back." For a moment it looked as though Reynolds might argue, but the intensity in Whitaker's gaze seemed to give him pause. With a visible effort, Reynolds took a step back, though the anger in his eyes remained. Lisa didn't relax. She knew all too well how quickly things could shift again, but at least for now, there was a semblance of control. Whitaker turned back to Lisa, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked. Lisa hesitated, unsure of how much to trust him. But there was something in his tone, something genuine, that made her decide to speak. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice still trembled slightly. "But he grabbed me. He wouldn't let go, even when I told him to stop. I was just trying to protect myself and my baby." Whitaker nodded thoughtfully, as though weighing her words. He glanced briefly at the crowd that had gathered, taking in the concerned faces and the quiet murmurs of those who had witnessed the altercation. "Did anyone here see what happened?" he asked, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the noise. Several people stepped forward, including the woman in jogging clothes and the man in the baseball cap. "We all saw it," the woman said firmly. "She didn't do anything wrong. That cop was way out of line." The man in the baseball cap nodded in agreement. "Yeah, he grabbed her first. She only pulled the taser after he wouldn't let go." Whitaker listened carefully, his expression serious. He didn't interrupt or dismiss their statements, which gave Lisa a small sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't end in disaster after all. But Reynolds wasn't done yet. "They're not law enforcement," he said, his voice rising. "They don't know what constitutes resisting arrest. She refused a lawful order. That's enough for an arrest." Whitaker turned toward Reynolds once more, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Officer Reynolds," he said quietly but with a tone that brooked no argument. "Stand down." Reynolds's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked as though he might refuse. But eventually he took a step back, though his glare remained fixed on Lisa. Whitaker sighed softly, as if trying to release the tension that still hung heavy in the air. "Look," he said, addressing both Lisa and the crowd, "we can stand here and argue all night, or we can figure out a way to resolve this without things getting out of hand." Lisa remained silent, still wary. She wasn't ready to let her guard down, not with Reynolds still standing nearby, radiating hostility. Whitaker seemed to sense her hesitation. He took a step closer, but not too close, just enough to lower his voice so only she could hear. "I understand that you're scared," he said gently, "and I understand why. But I promise you, I'm here to help de-escalate this. No one's going to hurt you or your baby. I'll make sure of that." Lisa studied his face, searching for any hint of dishonesty. But all she saw was a tired man who seemed genuinely intent on keeping things from getting worse. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "But I wanted on record that he grabbed me first. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to protect myself." "Understood," Whitaker replied. He turned back to the crowd. "If anyone here is willing to give a statement, we'll take down your information. We want to get this right." Several people nodded, stepping forward to offer their contact details. Whitaker motioned for a younger officer who had just arrived to start taking down names. Meanwhile, Reynolds stood off to the side, seething silently. He clearly wasn't happy with how things were unfolding, but for the moment, he seemed to recognize that pushing further would only make him look worse. As the younger officer began collecting statements, Whitaker gestured for Lisa to follow him a few steps away from the crowd. "Let's talk privately for a minute," he said. Lisa hesitated but eventually followed, still holding Mia tightly against her chest. Once they were a bit further from the crowd, Whitaker spoke again, his voice low. "I know this was a bad situation," he said, "and I'm sorry you had to go through it. Officer Reynolds, well, he can be a bit overzealous sometimes." Lisa raised an eyebrow at that. "Overzealous," she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "He assaulted me in front of my child. That's not overzealous, that's abusive." Whitaker didn't argue. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the truth in her words. "You're right," he said, "and I'll make sure this is looked into properly. But right now, my main concern is making sure you and your baby get home safely. Lisa didn't fully trust him, but she appreciated the effort he was making to calm things down. Thank you, she said quietly. I don't want this to happen again, to me or anyone else, I understand, Whitaker said. And I'll do what I can to make sure it doesn't. He glanced back toward Reynolds, who was now standing near the patrol car, still looking furious. In the meantime, I'll have Officer Reynolds leave the scene. He's not helping matters by staying here. Lisa nodded, grateful for the gesture. That would help, she said. Whitaker motioned toward the younger officer, who walked over to relay the message to Reynolds. After a brief but heated exchange, Reynolds reluctantly got into the patrol car and drove away, leaving behind a palpable sense of relief among the crowd. With Reynolds gone, the tension in the air seemed to lessen slightly. Lisa let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Mia had finally stopped whimpering and was now snuggled quietly against her chest, her tiny fingers clutching at Lisa's blouse. Thank you, Lisa said again, this time with a bit more sincerity. I just want to go home now, Whitaker nodded. Of course, he said, if you're comfortable walking, we won't stop you. But if you'd prefer, we can give you a ride. Lisa considered the offer but ultimately shook her head. I'll walk, she said. I need some air. Whitaker didn't argue. He simply nodded and stepped aside, allowing her to pass. As Lisa began walking away, several people in the crowd offered her words of support. You did the right thing, one woman said quietly. That cop was out of line. Lisa offered a faint smile in response but didn't stop walking. She just wanted to get home, to put this whole ordeal behind her. As she left the park and made her way down the quiet street, Lisa couldn't help but replay the events in her mind. The fear, the anger, the desperation, it all lingered, like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. But beneath it all, there was something else. A spark of defiance, a reminder that she had stood her ground and protected her child. And for that she felt a small measure of pride. Lisa walked down the quiet street, the weight of the evening pressing down on her shoulders. Mia had finally dozed off in her arms, her little head resting against Lisa's chest. The tension from the confrontation with Reynolds lingered like a dull ache, and though Lisa was relieved it had ended without her being arrested or injured, she knew this wasn't truly over. Even after Reynolds had been forced to leave the scene, the encounter left her feeling vulnerable, exposed, and deeply unsettled. She was trying to shake off that feeling, telling herself over and over again that she had done the right thing by standing her ground, but a gnawing voice in the back of her mind whispered otherwise. What if things had gone differently? What if the officer hadn't backed down, and she had been forced to use the taser in front of all those people? Would she have made it home at all? Her grip on Mia tightened, as if silently reassuring herself that they were safe for now. The soft sound of her footsteps echoed off the pavement as she neared her apartment complex, a modest building with faded brick walls and a rusting iron gate. She glanced around, checking her surroundings out of habit. Years of living in this neighborhood had taught her to always be aware, especially at night. But as she reached for the gate, she heard the unmistakable rumble of a car engine idling nearby. She froze for a moment, her senses on high alert. Slowly, she turned her head, and there it was, a police cruiser parked across the street, its headlights off but the engine still running. Her pulse quickened. Was it Reynolds? Had he come back to intimidate her after being sent away by Sergeant Whitaker? The thought made her stomach knot with anxiety. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was just another officer patrolling the area. Maybe it had nothing to do with her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. As she opened the gate and stepped into the courtyard, she kept one eye on the cruiser. It didn't move, but the fact that it was still there, watching, made her feel as if she were being hunted. Lisa reached her apartment and unlocked the door with shaking hands. She stepped inside, quickly locking the door behind her. The familiar surroundings of her small living room, with its worn couch and cluttered coffee table, brought her little comfort tonight. She set Mia down in her crib, gently tucking a blanket around her before collapsing onto the couch. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had stood up to a police officer, an aggressive one at that, and now there was a patrol car parked outside her building. Was this retaliation? Was Reynolds sitting in that car, waiting for her to come back out so he could finish what he had started? The more she thought about it, the more her fear began to shift into anger. She had done nothing wrong. She was a mother trying to protect her child, and yet here she was, feeling as if she were the one who had broken the law. This wasn't right. It wasn't fair. But fairness didn't seem to matter when people like Reynolds were involved. She knew that all too well. For years she had watched friends and neighbors deal with harassment from officers who saw them as nothing more than troublemakers. And now, it was happening to her. A sudden knock at the door jolted her out of her thoughts. Her heart leapt into her throat. Who would be knocking at this hour? She hesitated, staring at the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Another knock came, louder this time. MS. Carter? It's Sergeant Whitaker. Can we talk for a moment? Lisa's breath caught. She hadn't expected to see him again tonight, but his voice sounded calm, almost apologetic. She got up slowly, peeking through the peephole to confirm it was indeed Whitaker standing outside, alone. After a moment's hesitation, she unlocked the door and opened it just enough to see him clearly. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone wary. Whitaker held up his hands slightly, a gesture meant to show he wasn't a threat. "I just wanted to check in on you," he said. "Make sure you got home okay." Lisa's eyes narrowed. "I'm fine. Why are you really here?" Whitaker sighed, glancing briefly over his shoulder as if checking to see if they were being watched. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "But after you left, I had a feeling Reynolds might not let this go. Well, let's just say he doesn't like being challenged, especially not in front of a crowd." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. "Is that his car out there?" she asked, nodding toward the cruiser across the street. Whitaker followed her gaze and frowned. "I don't know," he admitted, "but if it is, that's a problem." He turned back to her, his expression serious. "Listen, MS. Carter, I don't agree with what happened tonight, and I'll be filing a report about Reynolds' behavior. But if he's sitting out there because he's planning to harass you, we need to address it now before things get out of hand." Lisa crossed her arms, still unsure whether she could trust him. "And what exactly do you expect me to do?" she asked. "I already defended myself once tonight, and it nearly got me arrested. You think he's just going to stop because you tell him to?" Whitaker shook his head. "No, I don't. That's why I'm here. I want to help, but I need you to trust me." Lisa let out a bitter laugh. "Trust a cop? After what happened tonight? You've got to be kidding me." Whitaker didn't flinch at her words. He seemed to understand where she was coming from, and instead of arguing, he simply nodded. "I get it," he said quietly. "You have every reason not to trust me. But I'm not Reynolds. I'm not here to intimidate you. I'm here because I saw something tonight that shouldn't have happened, and I want to make sure it doesn't happen again." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lisa studied him carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, that made her believe he was telling the truth. He wasn't like Reynolds. He wasn't trying to assert power over her, he was trying to help. Finally, she exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Fine, she said. What do you suggest? Whitaker glanced back at the cruiser again before replying. If that's Reynolds out there, he's waiting for you to come back out so he can find another excuse to harass you. We can't give him that chance. I can stay here for a while, make sure nothing happens. And in the meantime, I'll start the process of filing a formal complaint against him. It won't fix everything, but it's a start. Lisa hesitated. The idea of having a police officer in her home, even one who seemed well-meaning, didn't sit well with her. But the alternative, being left alone with Reynolds possibly lurking outside, was worse. Okay, she said reluctantly. But just for a little while. Whitaker nodded. Understood. As she stepped aside to let him in, Lisa couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. Tonight had been a nightmare, but it wasn't over yet. There would be more battles to fight, more moments of fear and uncertainty. But for now, at least, she wasn't alone. And that was something. Whitaker took a seat on the couch, keeping a respectful distance as Lisa returned to Mia's crib. The baby was sleeping soundly now, unaware of the turmoil that had unfolded around her. Lisa watched her for a moment, drawing strength from her daughter's peaceful presence. Whatever happened next, she would be ready. She had to be. For Mia's sake. The atmosphere in Lisa's apartment was tense, even though neither she nor Sergeant Whitaker said much. He sat quietly on the couch, glancing occasionally out the window toward the parked police cruiser across the street. Lisa stood near Mia's crib, gently rocking it back and forth, as if trying to calm not just her daughter but also herself. The weight of the evening's events pressed heavily on her, and though she appreciated Whitaker's presence, the fear of what might happen next refused to leave her mind. Every few minutes, she cast a wary glance toward the window, half expecting Reynolds to storm in with some fabricated reason to arrest her. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of a car door slamming shut. Lisa tensed, her eyes snapping toward the window. Whitaker noticed her reaction and immediately got to his feet. He moved to the window and peered out cautiously. "It's him," he muttered under his breath, confirming Lisa's worst fear. Reynolds was standing outside the cruiser, his posture rigid, his face illuminated by the dim glow of a nearby streetlight. He wasn't alone. Another officer, one Lisa didn't recognize, had joined him. They were talking, though from this distance, it was impossible to hear what they were saying. Whitaker turned back to Lisa, his expression grim. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "I'll handle this." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him head for the door. She wanted to tell him not to go, that confronting Reynolds would only make things worse, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded silently, clutching Mia's blanket tightly in her hands. Whitaker opened the door and stepped outside, closing it gently behind him. From inside the apartment, Lisa watched anxiously as Whitaker approached Reynolds and the other officer. The tension between them was palpable, even from a distance. Whitaker's body language was calm but firm, while Reynolds looked visibly agitated, his movements jerky and aggressive. Lisa couldn't hear their conversation, but she could tell from Reynolds' expression that it wasn't going well. He gestured wildly with his hands, pointing toward the apartment several times, as if trying to justify something. The other officer stood off to the side, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the argument continued. Lisa felt a surge of anxiety. She didn't trust Reynolds not to escalate things further, and the fact that he had brought another officer with him only added to her unease. What if they decided to force their way in? What if this wasn't just about intimidation anymore, but something worse? She couldn't let herself be taken away, not when Mia needed her. The thought sent a wave of determination through her. She wouldn't go down without a fight. Outside, Whitaker remained composed despite Reynolds's growing agitation. "You need to leave," Whitaker said firmly, keeping his voice low but authoritative. "This isn't helping anyone. If you keep this up, you're only going to make things worse for yourself and for the department." Reynolds's face twisted in anger. "She threatened me," he snapped. "She pulled a weapon on me. That's assault on an officer, and you know it." Whitaker held his ground. "She was defending herself and her child. You grabbed her first, Reynolds. Multiple witnesses confirmed that. Let it go." Reynolds looked like he wanted to argue further, but the other officer, sensing the tension reaching a breaking point, stepped in. "Maybe we should leave, Mike," he said quietly. "This isn't worth it." Reynolds shot him a glare but didn't respond. His pride was clearly wounded, and it was obvious he didn't want to back down. But with Whitaker standing firm and the other officer urging him to leave, he had little choice. With a final glare toward the apartment, Reynolds turned abruptly and stalked back to the cruiser. The other officer followed, casting a nervous glance over his shoulder as he went. Whitaker watched them go, his expression unreadable until the cruiser pulled away and disappeared down the street. Only then did he allow himself to relax slightly. He took a deep breath before turning back toward the apartment. Lisa was waiting just inside the door when he entered. "Are they gone?" she asked, her voice tight with tension. Whitaker nodded. "For now," he said. "But I can't guarantee he won't try something again later. He's angry, and guys like him don't like being told they're wrong." Lisa let out a shaky breath, the weight of the evening's events finally catching up to her. She sank onto the couch, feeling drained both physically and emotionally. "I can't live like this," she said quietly, more to herself than to Whitaker. "I can't keep looking over my shoulder, wondering when he's going to show up again." Whitaker sat down across from her, his expression serious. "I understand," he said, "and I'll do everything I can to make sure this doesn't happen again. I've already started the paperwork for a formal complaint. With enough witness statements, we can build a case against him." Lisa looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Will that really stop him?" she asked. "Or will it just make him more determined to come after me?" Whitaker didn't have an easy answer to that. He knew how men like Reynolds operated, how they thrived on intimidation and control. Filing a complaint was the right thing to do, but it wasn't a guarantee of safety. Still, he couldn't let Lisa live in fear without trying to help. "It's a start," he said gently, "and if he does try anything again, you call me immediately. I'll be here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the apartment was the soft, rhythmic breathing of Mia as she slept peacefully in her crib. Lisa glanced over at her daughter, drawing strength from the sight. She couldn't afford to give in to fear, not when she had someone depending on her. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll do it. I'll give a statement." Whitaker nodded, a hint of relief in his expression. "Good. We'll take it one step at a time." He stood, preparing to leave. "Try to get some rest. I'll check in with you tomorrow." Lisa walked him to the door, locking it securely behind him once he was gone. She leaned against the door for a moment, closing her eyes as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. Tonight had been a nightmare, but at least it was over for now. As she returned to the living room and sat down on the couch, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but so was something else, a quiet, fierce resolve. She had stood up to Reynolds once, and she could do it again if she had to. She wasn't going to let him take away her sense of safety, her dignity, or her peace of mind. Not without a fight. Outside, the street was quiet once more. The night stretched on, calm and still, but Lisa knew better than to believe that the danger had truly passed. There would be more battles ahead, more moments of fear and uncertainty. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. With people like Whitaker willing to stand by her side, she had a chance. And for now, that was enough. The following morning, Lisa awoke to the soft morning light filtering through the thin curtains of her living room. The events of the previous night felt like a blur, yet the tension in her body was a clear reminder that it had all been real. She sat up slowly, glancing toward Mia's crib. Her daughter was still fast asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. Lisa took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety that clung to her like a second skin. She knew she had to stay strong for Mia and for herself. After getting up and going through the motions of her morning routine, Lisa sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. She knew she couldn't just move on as if nothing had happened. Reynolds was still out there, and though Sergeant Whitaker had promised to help, she wasn't naive enough to believe that the problem would disappear overnight. Men like Reynolds didn't back down easily. He had been humiliated in front of a crowd, and his pride had been wounded. That made him dangerous. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Lisa tensed, her heart skipping a beat. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. To her relief, it was Sergeant Whitaker, holding a small notebook and a coffee cup in one hand. She unlocked the door and opened it slightly, her eyes scanning the street behind him. "Morning," Whitaker said, offering a small, tired smile. "May I come in?" Lisa hesitated for a moment before stepping aside and allowing him to enter. Whitaker glanced around the apartment briefly, noting its modest yet cozy appearance. He could see the remnants of a life built on hard work and resilience, photos of Lisa and Mia, a few well-worn toys scattered on the floor, and a pile of books on the coffee table. It was clear that Lisa had worked hard to create a safe space for her daughter, and he felt a renewed sense of responsibility to ensure that safety wasn't taken away. "Did you sleep?" he asked as he took a seat at the kitchen table. Lisa shrugged, not bothering to hide her exhaustion. "Not really. It's hard to relax when you're wondering if someone's watching your door." Whitaker nodded, understanding her concern. "I get it. And I don't blame you for feeling that way. That's why I'm here to follow up on last night and start the formal complaint process." Lisa sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. "Will it even matter?" she asked quietly. "People like Reynolds, they don't just stop because someone files a complaint. If anything, it might make things worse." Whitaker sighed, knowing she had a point. "You're right, it might make him angrier. But it also means he'll be on record. It means there's accountability, and that's something he can't ignore. It won't fix everything, but it's a start." Lisa listened carefully, weighing his words. She had never been the type to seek out confrontation, but she wasn't the type to back down from a fight either. And this felt like a fight worth having, not just for herself, but for Mia and for everyone else who had been in her position. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll do it. I'll give a statement." Whitaker opened his notebook, ready to write. "Good. Let's start from the beginning. I'll need as many details as you can remember: what happened, what was said, and how things escalated." Lisa took a deep breath, recalling the events of the previous night. She described how Reynolds had approached her, how he had grabbed her arm and refused to let go, and how she had only pulled the taser in self-defense. Whitaker wrote everything down meticulously, occasionally asking follow-up questions to clarify certain points. As the interview continued, Lisa felt a strange sense of relief. Speaking about the incident, though difficult, was cathartic in a way. It allowed her to reclaim some sense of control over the situation. By the time they finished, Whitaker had filled several pages in his notebook. He closed it with a soft thud and set down his pen. "That's a solid statement," he said. I'll submit this along with the witness accounts we collected last night. With any luck, it'll be enough to open an internal investigation. Lisa leaned back in her chair, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. And what happens after that, she asked. What if they decide not to act? Whitaker met her gaze, his expression serious. If they don't act, we'll push harder. I've seen cases like this before. It takes persistence, but it's not impossible to get justice. You just have to be willing to fight for it. Lisa appreciated his honesty, even if it didn't completely ease her fears. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but hearing that someone was willing to stand by her made a difference. Thank you, she said quietly. For everything. Whitaker smiled faintly. Don't thank me yet. We still have a long road ahead. He stood, preparing to leave. I'll keep you updated on any developments. In the meantime, if Reynolds shows up again, or if you feel unsafe, call me immediately. Don't hesitate. Lisa nodded, walking him to the door. As he stepped outside, he paused, glancing back at her. You did the right thing, Lisa. Standing up for yourself, that takes courage. Not everyone would have done the same. Lisa watched him leave, his words lingering in her mind. Courage. She hadn't felt particularly brave last night, just scared and desperate to protect her daughter. But maybe that's what courage really was, doing what you had to do, even when fear threatened to overwhelm you. She closed the door and locked it securely, feeling a little lighter than she had before. The day passed slowly, with Lisa trying to focus on the little things, playing with Mia, tidying up the apartment, and making a simple lunch. She avoided looking out the window too often, not wanting to feed her paranoia. But as evening approached, she couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. She knew this wasn't over. Reynolds might be gone for now, but he wasn't the type to let things go easily. Later that night, as she was putting Mia to bed, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She picked it up and saw a message from an unknown number. It was short and to the point. You think you won? This isn't over. Lisa's hands tightened around the phone, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't need to guess who had sent it. The message was clear. Reynolds was still out there, still watching, still waiting. For a moment, fear threatened to consume her. But then she looked at Mia, who was sound asleep in her crib, her tiny face peaceful and untroubled. That sight gave Lisa the strength she needed. She wasn't going to let Reynolds or anyone else intimidate her into silence. She had started this fight, and she was going to see it through to the end. She picked up the phone again, this time dialing Whitaker's number. When he answered, she didn't waste any time. He's still coming after me, she said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. I got a message. I'm ready to file a police report. Whitaker didn't hesitate. I'll be right there, he said. Stay inside, lock the doors, and don't open them for anyone but me. As she hung up, Lisa felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But she wasn't alone, and she wasn't going to back down. Whatever came next, she would face it head on. For Mia, for herself, for everyone who had ever been in her position. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore, she was fighting for her right to live without fear. And that was a fight she intended to win.